Hi YouTube, my name's Ozzy. What I'd like to do today is show you 20 interesting vintage Adidas tracksuits going in chronological order from the middle 1970s to about 1990. All of these are tracksuits, so they have both tops and bottoms, and I'll show you the labels and so forth, so hopefully you get a sense of what real stuff looks like, but also how design changed across those 15 years. Let's start with something that we can virtually never miss. This bright yellow Schwan Adidas tracksuit made in Germany in the middle 1970s. It's got narrow trouser legs, stirrups and so forth. People would have been quite plain about wearing yellow in the day. Nowadays we'd probably, well, you'd have to be a bit careful about it. Again, a little bit later, perhaps the middle 1970s, this nylon, beige, very popular in the 1970s. This made in France in all likelihood. This particular one has quite wide legs to it, but there we are, sports wear sort of stuff. Slightly bright colour, this one, narrow legs, made in France again, a nylon material. Really, you can see there's very little design going on here. It's just plain. It's actually the object as a whole that's the design, rather than what's on it that's working at this time. Now a famous one, the Europa, a classic design. This you can always tell a Europa because it's got this cut into bit in the chest, on the jacket. This particular one is red on the top, blue on the bottom, and it's narrow legs with stirrups. Again, you could have bought this any time from like the middle 1970s up until the early 1980s. Not especially expensive, expected for sportswear and available in sports shops. Here we come to a classic, the Superstar tracksuit. A little bit unusual to find one in orange. Bjorn Borg, in his very early days, was sponsored to wear the Adidas logo, and he was seen in an orange one of these. I suppose it's also a Dutch football team kind of thing from the period. Again, made in France, very famous design, a little bit unusual to see in orange. We're coming now to the later 1970s. I mean, this one is still nylon, it's still a sportswear kind of thing. You've still got it for sports activity in your sports shop, and it would have been especially expensive. This particular one's got kind of flared legs on it, and very much colour of the time. Here again, another Superstar, this time in a slightly more sober colour than the previous one we saw. Cream, I guess, and brown. These were quite expensive actually. That would have cost you about £100 to buy back in the day. Made in France, and most of these were linked in some way with the Association of Tennis Professionals, or at least it always had that on the badge, like this one does, and this particular one in a fetching green of the period. Now we're coming into the 1980s, and here we have 1980s jogging suit. A lot of these simple jogging suits in acrylic kind of material were made in Tunisia. I think the franchise, although it's still Adidas, has moved on from manufacturing in France to other cheaper locations, but nevertheless very much street fashion this, and you can see a really bold transition from what we'd seen in the 1970s. We've got just a big colour block change from the top to the bottom as we come into the 1980s. And in about 1983, in fact October 1983, the autumn of that season, you could have bought this Lendl 1 with diamond pattern, again similar to the previous material that we saw in that jogging suit. This particular suit was available in Burton's back in the day, and it wasn't that expensive. You can see that the flock badge has started to emerge at this time. That was a new development from the early 80s, and sometimes that does wear out, but anyway, there we have that. And again, 1983, late 1983, Adidas has brought out a lot of block colour again, bold. This is all simple blue on the bottom of the trousers, but red on the top. same on the back. These were particularly expensive and very much about street fashion now, not so much about sportswear. Now we come to the sort of middle 1980s, and this is an example of the triacetate stuff that you might have seen at the time. This was quite expensive. If you wanted to buy something like this, you'd have to go to Olympus in Oxford Street or in Birmingham, that sort of thing. This particular pattern on triacetate was perhaps more available in France than the UK. We were more used to the first design, which was, I think, pretty much the only one we got to see in the middle 1980s. But very much fashion rather than sport here. Now this is a particular favourite of mine just because it's so simple. You've got the raglan design. I mean, you know, you almost, you know, if somebody asks you what was like the classic trackie design, it's a hood, it's a raglan, and it's some sort of stripe and that sort of thing. It's got kangaroo pockets. This particular thing has got a sweatshirt as well as the trousers. I notice it's still got the the stirrups there, so they're imagining you're going to actually play football in that or something. Here we've got one of the throwovers from Adidas, the famous ones, a little bit associated with breakdancing, middle 1980s, this sort of thing. I think this might be called the New York, I always forget which they are, but this one with trousers, pocket here, very much a classic of the middle 80s. And speaking of that, of course, you've got the Colorado, very much a breakdance classic again. This one with trousers, and you can see the flock. This flock's held out quite well. These were made in Europe, sometimes by Peter Black up north, what have you. This particular one is a UK one, probably made by Peter Black. And here's the first. I mentioned earlier that you got triacetates, this material. This is the first design. You can always tell it because it's got the 1, 2, 3 stripes. This happens to be white on the top and blue, but you got them in all sorts of variations. I mean, for instance, you got them in grey. The most common one you saw was in a navy blue with, I think it was a yellow, red, and some other colour. This particular one's in white. And then from the middle 1980s, this is actually 1986. This is a Lendl. I'll call it a Lendl 2 because the previous ones we saw with diamonds, they were when Lendl had an association with Adidas, and you had that kind of Argyle pattern. This is going slightly later, it's a little bit more abstract, very 1980s. This was the late season for 1986. This particular pair with trousers, they all are, I went down to Olympus to buy that. In fact, actually, you wouldn't believe it, I know I don't look old enough, but I was old enough to go down. I spent all my pennies. I went without food for a month. Now, here's some of the velours as we get towards the late 1980s. Actually, I say late, you could have bought some of these velours. This is the Challenger design. You could have bought some of these in early 1980s, but really they're running the whole way through. This is a little bit later. They come in all sorts of colours. I think Daley Thompson was famous for sporting this sort of thing with the cuff trousers and the 2 stripes that they had on the base. If you were lucky enough to live in France back in the late 1980s, you could have bought this. This is the laser design. Again, it's a kind of a velvet, that sort of thing. These are quite interesting because on the trousers they have these really bright half moon things which look like the back of a tiger's ears, that sort of thing, like a pretend eye. They were less common in the UK. Nevertheless, they were still quite expensive. If you wanted one, you probably have to go over to France to get it. You can see they weren't shy about the colours. This one, purple and green. And finally we come to 1990, the end of our period. You notice that the willingness to make complicated patterns over this has transitioned through the period, so that now we've got like this really complicated patch and sew malarkey going on here. The material isn't particularly expensive, but the money's gone into cutting and shaping this sort of thing. These were available in, I think, 1990. They're pretty much getting to the end of the time when you could be as complicated as this, and things moved on to something else in the 1990s. But anyway, that's my selection of 20 things passing 15 years. I hope you found that interesting. I'm still Aussie like I was at the beginning. Thanks for watching. Bye.